Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week we're going to focus in on culture, because I know that is a topic that is so interesting to many of our listeners. And it's particularly interesting at the moment as organisations are deciding their new working practices, locations, and many people are interested in what that's going to mean for culture. So as a result, I thought who better to talk to than Moussa, who is co-author of The Culture Puzzle. And he's joined us today, and we're going to think about how we can develop culture and what the impacts of hybrid or post-COVID working is for our organisational cultures. Welcome, Mario.
Thank you, Lucinda. It's great to be with you.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, Mario?
Sure. I wear a number of different hats. I'm a management consultant. I have my own firm, Moussa Consulting, and I have for quite some time. I've been a consultant for about 30 years, working with leaders on culture, strategy, effectiveness. And then I'm also an executive educator. I'm affiliated faculty at the University of Pennsylvania and NYU and a number of other schools. And then I'm an author, and The Culture Puzzle is my third book.
Okay, so what were your previous books about? Were they also about culture?
They were about topics related to culture. The first one was about communication. It's called The Art of Woo, Using Strategic Persuasion to Sell Your Ideas. And then the second book was about teamwork, committed teams. I like to say that over 30 years, I've tried to cover the waterfront with respect to people issues in organizations, communication, collaboration, and now culture.
Love it. Okay, all the C's, absolutely. The woo, as in winning others over, the strength of woo. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah,
interesting.
Exactly. Making a connection.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we'll stick with culture because there's enough there. There's plenty on culture for us to fit in one podcast. In terms of, what is your sense in terms of working remotely? People working, what impact has it had on culture, do you think, having gone through a pandemic? What are you seeing?
I think one of the most important points to remember about culture, and we talk about this in the Culture Puzzle, is culture is always evolving. It's always moving. So I think sometimes we think it's static. We define it, we put the words on a flip chart, we display them around the office, and that's our culture. But culture is always changing, and I think we became acutely aware of that when the pandemic hit. For example, one day, most of us were working in the office. Next day, we were working from home. And then we learned how to adapt in working from home. So in that respect, culture is always moving. Culture is about learning and adaptation, and it never stands still. So the point that's relevant today is as a lot of us are heading back to the office from home, is culture is going to change again. So I think the most important thing to pay attention to is, how is it changing? How would we like it to change? How do we engage others in working together on this change?
And that how would we like it to change, I think, is probably the thing that is most interesting. Not how would we like it to change and how do we make that happen, I think is gold dust if we could come and get some insights
Absolutely.
into that, because we usually just experience it and you kind of go, okay, we need to change the culture. We talk about culture change all the time, but it is really quite hard to do. And what tips do you have there?
Well, it's that's a great question. So for us, as I said, culture is always changing. It's a process, and we like to say that it's driven by four forces. and this is relevant to your question, vision, interests, habits, and innovation. So vision is what you'd like your culture to be. And I'll come back to that because as you point out, that's a really critical issue. And then interest is what people need to do their jobs well. And we have a lot of needs, but three basic needs are to be connected to others, to have meaningful work, and to be recognized for our work. And then habit is about the way we do things. Interesting aspect about culture is it comes from the past, but then it carries us into the future, and we're always reinforcing culture. The way we do things around here is a common phrase. So it's good to pay attention to habits. And then innovation is about doing things differently and better. So vision, interest, habits, and innovation. And for us, the whole process, and you put your finger on this, begins with vision. In other words, what do we want the culture to be? And a really important point there, and I think this is a common mistake, and we all tend to make it when we get busy and distracted. We think, well, if I know what I want the culture to be, collaborative, creative, whatever the case may be, okay, I've defined the culture. But if a vision is just your vision alone, it's not really an effective vision. So to make a vision move, you have to involve other people in it. So I would say start with, particularly during this time as people are heading back to the office and there's a lot of uncertainty, start having conversations about how you ideally want to work with others, how you would like to define the culture, what are the values that are most important for your organization right now, and then listen to others. And I can't emphasize that that last point enough. Listening is key. I think when it comes to culture, defining our values, defining our purpose, there's too much telling and not enough listening.
That's a really interesting point, because I've just been doing a podcast on a webinar on sort of hybrid working and how we can work with other people. And actually, there's and worse than not telling, there's a lot of just kind of assuming as well, where you just kind of go, well, we've been doing it, then let's just carry on. So the whole benefit of asking and listening, I can see you start to co-create, but you also get people to become, I suppose, is it like consciously competent or consciously aware of what the culture is, and think, oh yeah, I want people to be responsive to me, but actually I'm aware that I have my out of office on all the time, or do not disturb, so I'm not responsive to them. So it's almost getting people to think about what their personal impact is on the culture, and then what they want it to be.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on a phrase that you use, carrying on. Human beings are really good at carrying on. We're creatures of habit. So, we get used to doing something a certain way. And then, we might step back and ask, okay, why do we do things this way? Because that's the way we do things. And that's an important cultural force. So if you hit the pause button and say, okay, let's talk about how we want to be, and let's talk together about how we want to be. And maybe we will discover that we want to create new habits and reinforce those habits. So let's say we don't work with our office doors closed, or let's say we hold meetings differently, or let's say we make decisions differently, all key activities to running an organization. So I think it's important to harness the force of habit or momentum, but you don't want to be carried away with it unconsciously as you're carrying on.
Yes. So it's taking the habits that we have all created at the end of the day over the last 15 months or so. We've got into certain ways of working, and some of those habits might be positive or otherwise culturally. So taking that point to now to talk about where we are and whether it's where we want to be, or what's the natural. It's almost playing it forward into, if we carry on like this, what will we end up doing? And how does that meet with the vision that we'd like it to be?
Absolutely. And I think a tension that I think a lot of us are aware of, if you're talking to your colleagues or reading the business press, is it may be that there is a kind of disconnect between leaders and workers. That is, a lot of leaders, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners have been reading about this, want people to come back. They want to go back to the old way. But as you point out, for 15 months, we've been working differently. And so we've come to think differently about work. Our aspirations are different. Okay, maybe I could have a different balance. Maybe I could work really hard for 3 hours and do my laundry or play with my kids. So
yeah,
our
and not just
mindset
not
has
commute
changed.
and not spend all that time in commuting. That is in itself fascinating, isn't it? So it's the people who haven't changed their mindsets. For me, that is it's about trust, whether or not people trust them. And is that about, in your vision piece, it talks about shared assumptions. So it's like there's one set of vision or assumptions about people's motivation for these managers. It's not all managers who want things to go back the way they were. And I know that there are some businesses where they actually do need to physically be in an office ideally,
Sure.
but not everybody. So what does that mean? Is the issue with the managers, or what does that say about the management culture, or how would you sort of pinpoint that problem and address that issue?
Yeah, I would point to one phenomenon in particular, and I see it in every organization I've worked with over 30 years. Leaders tend to get trapped in their own bubble, and they don't test their assumptions. So if you look at, for example, patterns of communication, what you'll see is most of the communication on a top team is happening within that top team, and not a lot of communication bubbles up to that top team. And so the risk is that leaders, and this is true generally for people in any team, but the risk is that we get trapped in our own assumptions, and we're not paying attention to what other people are thinking and feeling. So being in the office might work for you for whatever reason. Maybe you live around the corner from your office and you've got an easy commute. But if someone has to commute an hour each way or more, they're going to feel really differently about coming back to the office. And that could have an effect on their performance. So I think it's really important to, again, pause and ask, okay, what are our assumptions? But the best way to get outside of yourself and your assumptions is, again, to have a conversation and listen and ask, okay, as you're having a conversation, and let's make this really concrete. This might involve having a Zoom where everybody has an opportunity to speak, or you bring people together into a conference room. Maybe you social distance if that's what people need to feel comfortable. And then you just go around the room and have everyone talk about how they're feeling about coming back to the office and what they feel they need, the kind of support they need to do their jobs well. Listen and then respond. And it sounds so simple, but we don't do it. And this goes back to something that you said earlier, because we're always carrying on. We're just doing our jobs. And it's really easy to fall back into old habits. So, being deliberate, or as you put it, consciously competent, is really important when it comes to this cultural process.
I've been using the term a lot of intentional, because I perceive that to make hybrid working effective, but so actually you were able to take for granted networking and collaboration and relationships. If you're in an office environment, they would just happen naturally. And one of the things, it's interesting that in your model, you've got vision, interest, innovation, and habit in your model, that they kind of relate the interest, which is relationships, and the innovation bit. Those are the two bits that you hear people being worried about missing in that. And I think maybe because they happened by accident, they weren't intentional. And maybe if we want those things to happen in a hybrid environment, we're going to have to be more intentional about creating time for relationships, when you're not just going to bump into people by the coffee machine, and creating time to collaborate or problem solve.
I like the term. I like the term intentional, and I want to tie it to the points that you were just talking about. So, I think a lot of us believe that innovation is driven by the chance encounters and water cooler conversations and so on. I think that there's evidence that's emerging, and I've been writing about this recently, that actually innovation might occur more easily when we're working remotely. That is, if we're commuting, we're tired, we're grumpy. So it's not clear, and Google and other companies have been looking at this pretty closely. It's not clear that we need to be face to face to think creatively together. At the same time, to your point about intentionality, I think we should be intentional about how we come together. So
Yeah.
when do we want people to be talking to each other about a new product or a new process? And how do we create an environment, whether it's face-to-face or totally virtual or hybrid, where people feel safe and can trust each other enough to speak openly about their ideas? I think those are key questions. So trust, openness, support. I think those are the things I'd rather have leaders be thinking about than should we be face-to-face or hybrid or remote.
Yeah, and I suppose I was going to think, is this, how does this come all back to culture? It is culture then. So really what we're saying is, if you want to have a hybrid, and we're talking in the context of hybrid, if you want to have something that's going to be effective, it is about how people choose to interact. It's what they're thinking as opposed to what the leaders are thinking, going back to your kind of concept of them being in a bubble. It's what people do, how we do things around here. It's still, if you took it away from hybrid and people say, oh, we want to check, well, I suppose, so there's two things here. One, I'm thinking, if you have got a more traditional command and control culture, that is going to be harder to maintain, or actually possibly is not the recipe for success in a hybrid environment. It's got to be much more collaborative. But in terms of other areas,
just a quick comment about that. I think I wouldn't be sorry if most command and control cultures went away. Yes, sometimes you have to work in a command and control kind of way, like let's say in certain kinds of manufacturing environments, certain high risk environments. But even in those environments, I think, for example, if you talk to special forces military, or you talk to people in manufacturing environments, what you'll hear from those who are reflective about their leadership is, yes, sometimes we have to tell people what to do. We operate in a command and control kind of way, but not all the time. And I think that goes back to the intentionality point. So
and you can't do that if they're remote, can you?
Yeah. And then how are we getting our work done? So your question was, isn't this all about culture? Absolutely, it is. It's all about culture, because culture is about how we get our work done. We all have an interest in doing our work well.
So is it that simple then, in terms of culture? It's really about engaging individuals and understanding what they want and sort of co-creating what we need to do.
Yes. So I would say that in terms of our framework that we describe in the culture puzzle, it's simple, but it's not easy to implement. Because work is hard. So just let me step back for just very briefly and talk about the framework that we've been discussing. The 4 forces: vision, interest, habits, and innovation. For us, it's a kind of checklist. And it's a reminder of the things that you should be thinking about when you're building a culture and strengthening your culture. So it's a checklist, but it doesn't do the work for you. So surgeons have a checklist. They go into an operating room and they check the patient's name and check to make sure they're operating on the correct side of the body, so on and so forth. Pilots have checklists. Engineers have checklists. That doesn't mean that their jobs are easy. Similarly with culture, with those whose concern is culture. This is a checklist. These 4 forces doesn't make your job easy, but from our perspective, it does help you focus on the right factors. And as we say in the culture puzzle, it's those 4 forces that drive culture. So it's a reminder to be paying attention to the right thing. So the checklist is simple, the job not so simple.
I like your model, because I mean, when I've looked at some of the cultural models before, I'm thinking about Edgar Schein's work and others, the Onion model and other cultural paradigms, if you like.
Yeah.
This is quite, it feels quite common sense in terms of quite easy to get your head around and quite practical. Because often when you think about, I suppose, symbols, or when they say they're symbols of the culture, you can think, oh, how do I affect those sort of things? Whereas I feel like vision, interest, innovation and habits, they're all things that as a manager or an HR professional, you can talk to people about, you can get hands on, and potentially you can influence them. Is there a particular order in which you would see that people should consider these?
Yes, and we would say start with vision. So what do we hope the what do we want our culture to be? What are our values? What are our aspirations? And then listen. Okay, how does this affect what people really need? And we've touched on some really fundamental needs, like a need for connection, a need for purpose, a need for recognition. And then when we've had that conversation and come together around a shared vision, or as we like to put it, following the sociologist Benedict Anderson, when you've created an imagined community. For us, a culture is an imagined community. We're imagining together how we want to work. So once we've done that, then it's important to ask, okay, how do we create the right habits that support that vision? And one of the best ways, and this is really concrete and pretty simple, I would say, is focus on meetings. So every time you meet, every time you come together virtually or face to face, you have an opportunity to reinforce your culture. In other words, you can address questions such as who speaks, who doesn't speak, how do we speak, how long do you speak, how do we make decisions, so on and so forth. So what are the right habits or rituals that we want to create to reinforce those values? And then let's practice, let's experiment. And that's where innovation comes in. So let's say we are experimenting with, in every meeting, designating someone as the productivity expert, and they're kind of an observer. And then at the end of the meeting, they give a report out. Here's how we did against 3 or 4 criteria. And then maybe after action reviews, you institute after action reviews. So it could be any number of practices you put in place to enforce your desired values. And then you see what works, you experiment, you innovate. So you could think of that as 4 steps: envision, listen, engage, experiment. And then you do it all over again, because culture isn't static. It's always moving. Just a word about those who have come before us, like Ed Schein, who's a great thinker, and we learned so much from him. I think what's different about our model is it emphasizes the movement of culture. Culture is dynamic. Symbols are static. And one of the challenges I found when I was looking at the early work on culture is I kept asking myself, okay, so there are symbols, but how do they come into play? How do they affect us? And it all started to click for us when we realized that in every encounter, you're reinforcing and subtly changing possibly the culture. And that way, culture is very dynamic.
So one of the things that I was just reflecting on because I remember there's a number of the cultural pieces, and I've looked at culture change myself because I wrote a book on change management and was looking at those culture change things. And I was thinking, well, how do things like processes fit in? But of course, processes are basically organizational habits, aren't they?
Absolutely.
So if you want to change it. So and so if we want to change something, so your point about it being mobile is what do we want in terms of the habit, that envisaging, but there's also, it's about looking at, if you imagine just, let's say, not stakeholder, the force field analysis, and you're trying to think about a change, you've got all of those habits that are already in place that might be supporting the old way. So we've also got to be alert to, yes, create the new habits, which should be about as being collaborative and maybe a virtual hybrid working environment. So we maybe do team meetings where everyone's on Zoom and we have somebody, we have some social conversation at the start. We put things and you've got your ideas person and we create those habits. But we probably also have got to be alert to the other habits that are there. Again, this unconscious habits that are maybe there that may be pushing the old culture.
Absolutely.
As well, being alert to it.
Yeah, that's a nice connection, the force field idea, which goes back to Kurt Lewin. And, culture or organizations, societies often feel static because you have conflicting forces. You have forces driving forward and then forces holding change back. So, often our experience is stasis. Okay, things are just sitting in place. But the fact is that in that model, and in our model that we describe in the culture puzzle, the organizations are dynamic because you have always these forces moving. Like there are some people who are pushing ahead. They're experimenting with new ways of working. Maybe they go work somewhere else and they come back with different work practices. So culture is never static. It's always moving in that sense. Like we make a mistake and we realize, oh, actually, this is a good mistake. I could do things better. Maybe I don't have to send this memo, or maybe I need to send a shorter memo. So in all those ways, culture is always moving. And then, I keep going back to your observation. It's important to be intentional, or as we put it in the book, not be on automatic pilot from time to time. Sometimes it's good to be on automatic pilot, because then you're just going about your work and getting things done. But sometimes it's important to switch off and ask, okay, maybe we could do things a little bit differently. And that's a question that leads to harnessing the force of innovation.
Yeah, and my brain's gone there as well. It is interesting though, I feel like all of these topics interconnect. So your observation earlier is actually innovation you don't kind of sit in a room and go, right, think tank, let's innovate. Yeah. Often you get your ideas when you're out walking countryside, or if I'm out walking the dogs and I've got a podcast on, then often I'll get ideas, not that it may be triggered by the podcast, but I'm thinking. Or if we were collaborating with somebody, you could be chatting to someone and the ideas come out. It's almost about how you are at the time, as opposed to, it's not something you can force, isn't it?
Yeah, we like to say, and we have a whole chapter on innovation in the culture puzzle. What we found is innovation comes out of the work. So if you look at the research on innovation in organizations, it turns out that very few new ideas that stick come out of formal R&D processes. Most of the new ideas that work come out of the work itself, in just the way that you're describing. Like software engineers come together, they have a discussion, they see a new design, and they try it out. That's how innovation happens. Or you get up from your desk, you go for a walk, you walk the dog, and then you have an idea.
It's just a connection happens. It's almost when you're not thinking, the connections happen. And of course, the other thing where this links to is something like coaching or reflection, and maybe giving people the opportunity to pose a question and just to stop and think, is there a better way? Is that the best way to do it? Or what's working about how we're doing things currently? What would we like to be different? And again, your point earlier about we shouldn't just carry on. Is when we're doing that, we're not stopping and thinking and going, is this the best way? Which is really, this is our opportunity right now, is to stop and think, and is this the best way for us?
And I think the best kind of coaching, and I know that you're an expert at this, is to create a space in which someone can become conscious of their thoughts and feelings. And I think as a leader, as an HR leader, any kind of leader in an organization, one thing you want to be thinking about is, how do I create those spaces in my organization where people can think and be conscious of what they're thinking and access that force of innovation, which is always happening. I think one of the interesting things we learned in the culture puzzle is that innovation is always working. We're wired to innovate. And fundamentally, culture is a process of collective learning and adaptation. So yeah, is it symbols? Absolutely. It involves symbols. Is it the way we dress? Yeah, the way we speak, it's that. But fundamentally, it's about learning and adaptation. And we're wired to do that.
And that's about recognizing culture. Symbols and stuff, they're about how recognizing it is. And actually, in fairness, that does go back to what Edgar Stein says, you don't change it from the outside in. They're the outside manifestation of the culture. Yeah. If we want to change it, it's about talking about it, thinking about it, allowing people to be creative. And it's about being aware of those habits that aren't helping it, and changing some that are supportive of the way we want to be in terms of our vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And engaging that process of, as we were describing earlier, of envisioning, listening, reflecting, and experimenting. I think that's the best way, from our perspective in the culture puzzle, that's the best way to change the culture from the inside, not top down. It's often said culture comes from the top, and there's some truth in that. But the fact is that no one owns culture. Culture is everywhere. It's on the move everywhere in your organization. So if you can engage people through this process, you're going to get a whole lot more out of them day to day. They're going to feel more empowered. They're going to be more creative. They're going to be more satisfied. They're going to feel connected. There are so many ways in which you're going to create a stronger, thriving culture.
And command and control is not going to cut it. And you've got to trust people to be adults to be able to get there. Tell me, so it's about envisaging, listening. I got experimenting. What was the?
Engaging.
Yeah, you can't do that. Engaging. Absolutely. You can't do it. There's no quick fix. You can't go around and just tell people to do it. That isn't going to make culture change. That is completely different. It is about taking people with us.
You know, on the book, we worked with a New Yorker cartoonist, Kendra Allenby, and she drew cartoons for each of the chapters.
Yeah, they're nice. I really like them.
Yeah, and one of the cartoons shows a man who's clearly a boss, and he's talking to a woman standing next to him, and he's looking at these workers in their cubicles, and he says, you know, these people aren't happy. Why aren't they happy? They didn't get the memo I sent out this morning about being happy.
Yeah, I know exactly. It's a bit like Dilbert type thing, that, isn't it? Yeah. They're great. So I think that's really a really helpful and practical conversation that we've had so far in terms of this, Mario. I guess in terms of we've talked about how people do it, how I can do it, envisaging, listening, engaging, experimenting. We've talked about your powers in there in terms of our vision, interest, habits, and what was the other? Was about people, wasn't it?
Innovation. Yeah.
So, yes, interest in innovation. So those align, don't they? Are there any final points that you think would be useful for our HR Uprising audience to take out of this book? And obviously, they can get your book. It's Barrett Kohler Publishers, isn't it? It's called The Culture Puzzle. So I assume it's available online.
Everywhere. Online, bookstores, everywhere. So I think the point that I would want to leave your listeners with is that culture comes first. That's a key point. And what we mean by that is culture is wired into our bones. So we come together and we form a group. So human beings are social, and that goes way back. We learned we do better in groups than we do alone or in pairs. So we come together, and immediately there's a culture. And the important point, the important practical point, is you can't stand outside of culture. Often the assumption seems to be, oh, okay, we've got finance, we'll put that together. We've got operations, we've got sales, so on and so forth. And then all those pieces are in place. Then let's talk about the culture. Well, you can't step outside of culture. So the way you talk about finance, the way you organize sales, that's cultural.
Yeah.
So culture comes first. And I think once you realize that, then you become a bit more conscious, a bit more intentional about culture and how it shapes everything that we do. So I think that's what I would leave your listeners with. Culture comes first.
Yeah, and reflect on what the culture is that you're setting, you're part of. And
absolutely.
And people who are trying to change their culture, it can be challenging, but there's some tools here. Talk to people about it. It's almost bottom up, actually, in terms of the leaders may not be demonstrating a certain way, but actually get that groundswell of people by talking and engaging them.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Mario, if people would like to connect with you, are you on things like LinkedIn, or how would they get in touch if they wanted to follow more of your work?
Yeah, sure. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I have a website, Moussa at moussaconsulting.com, and would love to hear from people, love to engage in a dialogue about culture.
Well, we'll put all of your connections on our webpage for the episode. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure having this conversation.
Yeah, my
really
pleasure.
Fascinating.
Take care.
Thank you.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.